Good afternoon, everyone. We were expecting a few more people to join us today, so that's why we've just been waiting a few more minutes. And if it's okay with everyone, we'll just continue to wait just at least till 10 past and see if we get some more joiners. Joiners. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if you heard me earlier. We're just waiting on a few more people to join us.
I think if we just give it a couple of minutes, Judith, we'll just then start.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping points before we start. The meeting will be recorded and made available on the scheme website. Questions can be submitted via the chat function. Questions can be submitted anytime, but will not be answered until after the presentation has been completed. We will respond to as many questions as possible after the presentation, and all the questions and answers will be published on the scheme website. Okay. Welcome to this. Can I just check? Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Right.
The slides have just been shared, Judith.
All right, great. Welcome to this information session on the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme. That's us done that slide, yeah. I'm Judith McVinney, and I'm the Communications and Stakeholder Manager working on the scheme alongside my colleague Julie. I'm joined by my colleagues Alistair Dawson and Richard Meeson. Alistair's the Road, Bridges and Flooding Coordinator for Falkirk Council and senior offices responsible for delivery of this project. And Richard is the engineering lead from Jacobs, who are responsible for the design of the scheme. This presentation will give background to the project, including the need for the scheme, what we've done to date, what's next, and most importantly, how we are looking to get your input into the process. The presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, and if anyone has any questions, please add these to the chat section and we'll get through them as many as we can at the end. And please don't forget there are more focused community events running this week and next week. Further details are on the scheme website. I'll now pass over to Alistair to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Judith, and good afternoon, everybody. As Judith said, I'm the Roads, Bridges and Flooding Coordinator with Falkirk Council, so looking after this project. What I would like to do, first of all, is just show you, obviously this is on screen at the moment, what the content of today's presentation will be. As you can see, scheme background, how we've developed solutions and what that means going forward into future construction phases. But also importantly, what we're looking for from the communities and how communities can get involved in each of the next steps And as we said, there will be an opportunity for as many questions to be answered towards the end of the presentation as well. So for the first section of the presentation, I'd just like to focus on some of the background, the things that drive a major flood protection scheme like the Greensmouth scheme. We'll obviously highlight our previous engagements with the public, what the flood risk is, what's driving the scheme, and also some of the key stages that we need to meet as the scheme progresses. Next slide, please, Alan. Thank you. As you can see from this timeline, the scheme's already been in development for around 5 or 6 years. So back in 2015 and 16, we commenced gathering some of the basic background information that's required for a flood scheme, and topographic data and ecological data that was gathered. And then through 2017 and 18, we began to look at various options and appraisals at different options against each other. And as part of that process, we had 2 previous community consultation events. Both these events were held as face-to-face events in community halls or Bowling Green. So there's one in 2018 and another one in 2019. And the feedback that we received from these previous events actually began to shape the outline design as it sits at the moment, and what we're going to discuss with you today. And also you can see that there's a number of community engagement, community information sessions planned throughout the rest of 2021 and into early 2022. And we will not be commencing the formal notification process, which is shown a little further down the diagram with the red box around it. And that formal process won't start until around the middle of next year. And at that stage, there are further opportunities for objections to be lodged, and those will be dealt with through the formal legal processes. In terms of construction, it's unlikely that there will be any form of construction before the mid-2020s. And when we do start to build the scheme, it's likely to be phased over a period of between 5 and 10 years. And obviously, as we get through the next few years and understand more of that information and the sequencing of those works, there will be more information passed out to the public at regular intervals during that process. So certainly not the start of the journey, and we're very much in the middle of the design phase of the project. Next slide, please. So just to recap briefly on some of the feedback that was provided from those previous sessions and how the project team has taken this information on board. Probably one of the more significant parts of the feedback came back in 2018 when that event helped to determine how the team would progress. There was options provided for how the flood defences through the middle of Greensmouth might look, and what defences were required, both to protect the town from the impacts of flooding from the rivers, but also from flooding from the tidal risk, and particularly around the Zetland Park area. The majority of people that provided feedback to the 2018 session voted that the option which reduced the number of defences along the Grange Burn, particularly the upper part of Grange Burn between Rannoch Park and Zetland Park, and a defence alignment that would stay close to the Grange Burn rather than the alternatives, which would have seen parts of Zetland Park allowed to become flooded in flood events. The community wanted to keep the proposed defence alignment quite close to the Grange Burn corridor. So this is the option that the design team has taken forward to this date, and which we'll discuss a little bit further, both today and then the dedicated sessions for each project, for each section of the project throughout the rest of this week and into next week. Also, in 2018 and 2019, the public asked for some more information on how the proposed scheme would be constructed, more details about the scheme. We've obviously set up our new website, and we've got social media channels, which you may already have seen. And obviously throughout 2020, like most things in life, it's been difficult to have further engagement due to the pandemic. But as I said on the previous slide, there will be further opportunities throughout this year leading up to that formal notification process, which is the legal step that we need to go to next. Next slide, please, Alan. So this slide's really just a little bit of a refresher to remind anybody who may have seen some of the consultation events previously. Grangemouth and the surrounding towns are at risk of flooding from a number of sources. Highlighted in the yellowy orange colour is the foreshore of the Forth Estuary, and up each of the watercourses is also at risk of tidal flooding. So the lower reaches of the Carron, the Grangeburn and the Avon can all be affected by tidal impacts. And then in the upper reaches of those three watercourses, around Stenhousemuir, Carronshore, Polmont, West Quarter, these areas, the predominant factor is from fluvial flooding, when there's a large rainfall event over the hills, and that water then makes its way downstream through those communities and eventually out towards the estuary. Next slide, please. So sometimes the feedback we get from communities is that there's a bit of a question around why do we need to have any scheme at all. There's maybe a lack of understanding of what the flood risk is at the moment. So this plan just demonstrates what is known as a 1 in 200 year flood. Now, the terminology is a little bit difficult to understand and can be a little bit confusing. So a 1 in 200 year flood doesn't mean that it will only happen once in a 200 year period. It simply means that any tidal or rainfall event has a probability of reaching these kind of flood levels, as a 0.5% chance of reaching these levels, and that's just what is known as a 1 in 200 year event. So as you can see from this plan, in a 1 in 200 year event as it currently stands, there are some quite extensive areas that would be subjected to inundation. Around the estuary and the frontage, a lot of that is in the industrial area, but along the watercourses, these are into many residential areas, including Grangemouth town itself and parts of Carron, Carronshore and up towards Larbert. And if we just go to the next screen, this just demonstrates that the blue areas are similar to what was on the previous plan, but the green areas are the additional areas which would be impacted with climate change. So obviously, as sea level rises, as more frequent and heavier rainfall events affect the watercourses, there are other areas over what is predicted at the moment. There are additional areas which could also be affected. So this plan shows obviously the eastern half of Grangemouth. You can see the River Avon. You can see the River Avon towards the bottom of the screen. The blue areas in the mainly industrial areas, and then the green areas that are starting to encroach more into the town and the residential areas. And the next plan, if we can just pop to crosshead, shows the western areas, where again large areas are at risk of tidal flooding, but also the areas of floodplain along the river, the course of the river. These areas increase, and you can see some green areas along the watercourses, where in the larger storm events you could have increased floods and increased level of flood water. In terms of numbers, the number of residential properties at risk at the moment is around 2,500, but with the predicted climate change, the number of properties, residential properties that are predicted to be at risk, rises to around 5,500. So quite a significant change, and obviously this is why we're looking at the proposed scheme and what we can do to provide that resilience for the communities. This slide really just demonstrates, as you might expect with a scheme of the scale and complexity of Grangemouth, there's a wide range of interested parties. So this slide just really demonstrates some of those groups and individuals that we are already consulting with. There's a wide range of statutory authorities, local groups, business groups, utility companies, lots of different people that need to be involved and need to be consulted on a project of this scale. And as I stated previously, this engagement process, which began a couple of years ago, will continue throughout the design development phase, leading up to that formal notification next year. So these next 6 to 9 months are really key to ensure that as many local people as possible have been made aware of the project, are aware of the proposals, and also have an important opportunity to provide some comment. Although we are restricted at the moment due to COVID from having face-to-face meetings, It is intended that some of the future consultation events that we hold throughout the rest of this year and into next year will be a range of digital events like this and face-to-face events where we can come out into the community and speak to individual people. Obviously, today's session is much more of an overview of the entire scheme, but we are starting to get into smaller groups of people that are focused on individual communities. And at some stage in the future, we'll have to come down and there may be a need to speak to individual properties or individual businesses, just to understand just exactly what their concerns are at an individual level, as well as the overall or the community level. So there'll be more information on that as we move forward. So I would like now just to hand over to colleague Richard Neeson, who will give us a bit more of the detail of the development of the scheme. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much, Alistair. I'm just going to run through the development of the scheme, which will initially look back at some of the options we considered in 2018-2019 as part of the option appraisal process. Then I'm going to move into kind of having to look at the different types of flood defences, and then kind of outline, I suppose, the proposed flood defence locations, and then I'll briefly touch on some of the environmental aspects. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'm going to talk through now some of the discounted options. There's a number of ways that we can, I suppose, offer flood protection. Not all of these options or solutions are viable or practical, and there's a number of factors that we need to consider, such as source of flooding, available space, presence of underground pipelines and for services. These kind of are some of the aspects that we've considered during the option appraisal. Some of the pictures outlined here give an example really of options that we have considered but discounted. All I would say is that with the flood storage, we have looked in quite a lot of detail with that on the River Carron and on the West Quarter Burn, and with the number of major accident hazard pipelines in the area, flood storage was not a viable option. With the runoff control, it's something that you may have read about in the press of late, for natural flood management. On the sizes of the watercourses that we have on the River Carron and the Avon particularly are quite large, and the 1 in 200 year flow is into the hundreds of cumecs. The runoff control isn't really going to work there, and it would have to be across the whole catchment wide as well, so that would pose issues and kind of ask the question really, is it practical? I'll touch on the tidal for barrier and gates probably on another slide, which we could come to. And dredging, again, it's something we have looked into, but because Alistair's mentioned that quite a lot of the watercourses are actually at tidal flood risk, the dredging aspect there isn't really going to be a sustainable or effective means of offering flood protection. Even on the fluvial watercourses, the environmental and the sustainable impact there means it's not an option that we've really progressed with. It's important to note that the property level of protection is something that we may well be having to explore further as a mitigation in parallel with other options there. Next slide, please. So we use this term flood defences quite a lot, and they can take many forms. So on the slide here are some examples of flood walls or flood embankments and flood gates. It's just kind of, I'm not going to really talk through each one individually. They just give an example of when we talk about a flood wall. These are the top left there is how it could look, or the bottom left, and even the bottom right. It's just to give a flavour of what these structures could be like as well. The earth embankment, again, They can be grassed, they could be flowered with wild flower seeds. There's a lot of ways that we can actually enhance that landscape with these flood defence structures. Next slide, please. So there's the next couple of slides. We'll kind of talk through the alignment really of the Grangemouth flood protection scheme, of the flood defences. We've colour coded where's a proposed flood wall and where's a proposed flood embankment, and we've identified floodgate structures. So we've got flood defences starting at Stirling Road on the River Carron, that kind of start near the bus depot area. They go along Stirling Road, and then we come down into the Carron and Carron Shore area, where we've got a flood embankment around the back of Park Road, and then we come down to a flood wall kind of on both banks by the Stenhouse Bridge and the New Carron Road Bridge, and then we come down to near the Chapel Burn, and we have a flood wall along the bank of the north bank of the River Carron, and along bits of the Chapel Burn, and then down into Carron Shore itself and around by for Dock Street area. Next slide, please. So the Lower Carron, which we term as Cell 2, we've got a flood embankment which starts at the canal entrance, so where the Charlotte Dundas path is. So there's a flood embankment to tie into high ground there, and that continues along to near the Jarvie plant site, and then we've got a flood wall that continues along the top of bank there, along past a number of the industrial sites around the Grangemouth Yacht Club, and actually ties into the flood defences in the port of Grangemouth, which comes into Cell 3. And we have a flood wall parallel to North Shore and South Shore Road, continuously around the port. I suppose people, one thing to note here is that we also have a port study ongoing at present, which relates to the lock gates at the port itself. So we need to change or increase the height of the gates at the entrance to the port, and we're doing a separate study on that and about what options are going to be practical there. Next slide, please. Cell 4, Cell 4 has been split into two parts, the north and south. So the north part covers the flood embankment that starts in Zetland Park, very near the play park, and continues north, and then changes into a wall, and then runs parallel to Park Road and Grangeburn Road, and ultimately then continues through part of the industrial complex. And on the other side of Abbots Road, we've got a flood wall that starts opposite the play park area, and again is parallel to the road all the way down to South Shore Road. We've got a number of floodgates in this area as well, to make sure that we do maintain access for pedestrians and for vehicles if we do have a flood event, and these will be utilised then. I would say with this area also, sorry, can we just pop back a slide? The flood defence alignment that is shown for Zetland Park, this goes back to what Alistair mentioned earlier in the slides about this is the alignment that the public preferred. So we're having to take the public's views on board and trying to work with everyone to come up with an alignment that works with the community. Next slide, please. This is Cell 4, the southern section. So due to the options that I've just outlined for the lower part of Cell 4 in Grangemouth town, we're trying to make better use here of the flood relief channel, and where we've got a blue star on the plan, that's a flow control structure. So the plan is to control the amount of the fluvial flows going down the Grangeburn and into Grangemouth town itself by diverting more flow into the flood relief channel and out into the Avon. A consequence of this means that we need to have flood defences, walls and embankments along most of the northern bank there and some of the southern bank of the flood relief channel. But we feel that is a good trade-off to reduce the number of structures within the Grangemouth town urban area. There is also some flood defences in the Bean Cross and Klondike area, which are to stop the Pullman and the West Quarter burns coming out of bank, and the flood defences along the Millhall burn for Reddock Road and Smithy Bray are there to stop the Millhall burn having to come out of bank and flood properties and land there. Next slide, please. Cell 5 covers the River Avon, so we've got more or less continuous flood defences down both banks of the River Avon from Hull Flats Road. The defences just to the south of Hull Flats Road are there to stop water having to overtop the road and cause the road to be closed. And where the defences end at the mouth of the Avon, they will tie into Cell 6, which covers the estuary frontage. There we go. So, they're continuous from Cell 5 and 6, the flood defences, and again the defences over on the very far northwest by the Grange burn, they link into the defences in Cell 4. But there's a range of flood embankments here and flood walls. It's probably worth having to note that the defences in Cell 6 particularly do encroach into the Firth of Forth special protected area, and I'll come on to that in the next slide now. So the environment is a key consideration when we're developing the flood protection scheme. Over the last 5 or more years, we've undertaken a number of surveys which have identified the presence of wildlife and important vegetation and habitats. The information is being used by the project team to consider the impacts of the proposed scheme during the short, medium and the long term, and where possible we are trying to avoid any impacts. An environmental impact assessment is being undertaken, and we are also doing a habitat regulations appraisal due to the encroachment into the Firth of Forth special protected area. It's probably worth having to note here that where it's not possible to have an impact, we are having to look at appropriate mitigation for this, and also to restrict on certain work areas or how we actually construct the flood defences. We'd also, I suppose, like to take the opportunity here that there is environmental opportunities for enhancements, and that's something that we're trying to explore through the environmental impact assessment. In addition to identifying impacts, we're also trying to identify the opportunities. So I think we've kind of talked along that. I suppose one thing I wanted to just be clear on is that we are mindful really of the carbon impacts that the scheme is likely to have. We are trying to look to reduce this through the choices of the materials that we use, the methods of construction, and also sequestration through the potential for tree planting and peat bog for restoration. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly go through these in the next few slides, really, about kind of what we're building, how we build it, and give you some kind of examples. Next slide, please. So these images just give you an example of a flood wall, a flood embankment. It's probably worth having to note here. You can see that from the middle picture at the bottom, there's an extensive amount of work that goes underground as such that people don't actually see. So the section of a flood wall that you see above ground may seem quite small, but there is a substantial amount of engineering work below ground. We need to make sure that the flood wall is constructed to the right height so that the water won't over top it, but we also need to make sure that water won't be able to go through our structure, say if it's an embankment, and we need to be mindful of water won't be able to go under our structure through some seepage. And we also, I suppose, it's to have an awareness is that during a flood event there is very large forces exerted onto these structures from the water itself, but also during an extreme event there's likely to be large debris, including cars or trees, and so we need to make sure these structures can withstand that impact. Next slide, please. So the pictures here are kind of just examples of flood protection works that have been undertaken in Scotland. They're in it as they just give you, I suppose, a feel for some of the working areas and some of the construction equipment that is likely to be used. It also kind of identifies, I suppose, that sometimes we might be having to work near a road, sometimes we might be having to create a temporary working platform in the watercourse. And the picture on the bottom left particularly is quite a good example. We're working near a watercourse, we can get a flood event during the construction works, so we need to be mindful of that and how we undertake the works. I mean, all the construction works will be undertaken by an experienced contractor with a track record of building schemes of this size and type. We won't be undertaking construction works during over the whole scheme area at once. We'll be working in discrete areas to control and to minimise the inconvenience. There will be a team who will be closely overseeing and for monitoring the contractor to ensure compliance with any stipulated constraints or conditions. Health and safety is our primary consideration for the public and for the workforce, and we will be engaging and consulting with the public from now onwards, but also throughout the construction phase of the works as well. Next slide, please. So there's some pictures here on the top and the bottom left. They're both in Glasgow. So this is, I suppose, pre-work pictures. The two pictures in the middle from 2012 are what we class as I suppose the day after construction works are complete, and the two pictures on the far right there are from last year. So the idea here is that you get an idea about how things have looked prior to the construction works having to commence once the flood defence is complete, but also then how the flood defence and how also the vegetation starts to grow back in a reasonably short period of time as well. They're just some examples really. Next slide, please. Cool. These are examples really of other flood protection schemes throughout Scotland, but it's to give you a feel for, I suppose, when we talk about flood the defences and walls, what could they look like? The top left there has got community artwork installed into it, but you can also get a feel for the middle top gives you an idea of where a flood wall's been constructed, very close to residential properties. So it's just to give you a feel for, I suppose, what some of the structures look like. And I'll hand you back to Alistair now.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for going through those slides for us. Yeah, just wanted to pick up on, what we said earlier on. This isn't the start of the journey, certainly not the end of the journey. There's a long way to go yet. This slide already picks up a few key themes that there will be those future engagement sessions, either online or public exhibition type events. There will certainly be some form of public exhibition in the early part of next year. Obviously, that's something we can't confirm the dates, the style of that yet, until we know a bit more about how any COVID restrictions might affect things. But we will be looking to take on some learning from the events in June this year, and to tailor those future events to understand what kind of themes or topics people are more interested in. And as it was noted, not necessarily everybody will have the same concerns depending on what area of the scheme they happen to live in or work in. The impact on communities in Carron Shore could be quite different to what it is in Abbots Road, Grangeburn Road areas, and obviously the industrial areas will be completely different again. So whether it's commercial or residential properties, we'll be speaking to those in different groups and different formats. Alongside the engagement events, we do have a STEM activity programme going into schools, part of the educational curriculum. That will also give school kids an opportunity to come out and do some site visits whenever there are construction works to obviously come along and see. It may well be that some of the kids that are involved in the STEM activities over these next couple of years, by the time they've gone through school, they may even have an opportunity to come and join the team and be part of that construction activity in the future, given that it's maybe 5-10 years away. And in terms of, I've noted there about competition, there will be opportunities for those schools. There'll be some sort of small competitions run through that activity. And we're keen to tie up with some of the other activities in the town. For example, we know that Zetland Park and the regeneration work that's going on in Zetland Park are planning a science festival next year. So it'll be quite nice for the educational programme that we're working on to tie into that science festival, and perhaps use that as an opportunity for the winners of any competition to come along and be presented with their prize as part of that event. And that leads me into what was said there on the right-hand side of the slide about a coordinated approach. Hugely conscious of the fact that there's an awful lot of activity in the Grangemouth area and the surrounding villages at the moment. The council are doing various types of activities, and all these need to sit hand in hand. We're not working alone. We're in contact with our colleagues across the council who are involved in these other projects, whether that's infrastructure projects on roads and flooding, whether that's some of the other community projects, and local housing strategy is one that we've pulled out there as an example, and town centre regeneration projects as well. So conscious that there's different consultation with communities and there's different projects going on in communities, and it may be that some of the things that we are proposing as part of the flood scheme can actually be delivered as part of or alongside some of these other activities that the council's already involved in. And also just saying that, in terms of when we get to the construction phase, there will be the opportunity for both local suppliers and local labour force to actually be involved in part of the construction activity, and there can be opportunities for employment through that. So what are we looking for at the moment? Well, as was demonstrated, we've been working on this project for sort of 5 or 6 years. We've developed some options and some proposed areas that we want to see defences constructed. The position of those defences and the height of those defences will largely be defined by the need for the scheme and where those risks need to be mitigated. But there's still elements of the project that we want the community to come back to us and feed it back into the information. Things like what the walls look like. Are there other opportunities for paths for cycling or walking? What landscaped areas and seating areas could be incorporated into the new defences, and is there opportunity for public art to be included, and what would that look like, and where would that be, and what would be the best way to introduce some other features into the project. So really, want to put the offer out there to everybody in the community to come and engage with us and talk to us, tell us more about what you feel and what you would like to see included as part of the project. We will do everything that we possibly can to either include it as part of the flood scheme or tie it into some of these other activities that are already going to happen in the Greensmith and the other village areas around about. So we just pop to I think it's the final slide, or maybe 2 slides to go. Yep. Just reinforcing what I said earlier on. We are having these consultation events this week and next week. There's 2 overview sessions today and next Tuesday, and then there's also 5 dedicated focused target groups where there'll be a little bit more detail on each of those focused community areas that we're talking about. We are looking to get some feedback from these sessions, so there'll be information passed out to everybody who signed up for the session to gain some feedback, and that's something that we'll learn from, and that will also then help to tailor what we include in our next round of engagement, which is likely to be in the autumn. But that will be an ongoing process. Be the autumn, probably something in the spring that'll be more like an exhibition, public exhibition drop-in session, and even once we go beyond that, even once we're into the construction phase, there'll still be opportunities for us to be visible and be part of the community and for any questions to be answered. These next 6 to 9 months are quite key, because we want to obviously make sure as much information is out in the public and as many people have had an opportunity to engage and be part of the process, so that when we come to the more formal legal process, which is likely to be around next summer, that people feel informed and feel that they already know much about what is likely to happen in their communities. Just go to the final slide. Just sorry, it's not the final slide, there's one more after this. Just a reminder of those dates. If anybody on the call today would like to attend one of the more focused groups, we've got the first one tonight covering the River Carron Shore area. Tomorrow night is Grangeburn, Zetland Park area. The following night is the lower part of Grangeburn Road out towards the docks. Then next week we've got a repeat of this session on Tuesday night. Wednesday is the Rannoch Park, Rannoch Road area. And Thursday night is downstream towards Millhall Burn, Floodreef Channel, and the bottom of Bowman, Smithy Bray area. If anybody would like to sign up for any of those, then the details are available through the scheme website, which is our final slide. Pretty sure, pretty confident. Yep, thank you. Just a reminder where the scheme website can be found. Obviously, we've got an email address as well, which is on that slide, Grangemouth FPS. And also we've got the Twitter and the Facebook accounts and the YouTube channel where some of the video fly-throughs will be available in the next few weeks once we've shared those at the community events. So that's all I'd like to say. I'd like to thank both Judith and Richard for their input into the presentation today. I believe Judith has probably got a few questions through already. If I can just hand over to you and you can maybe guide us through any questions that have come in.
Sure. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you'd be able to see the questions as well, but here we are in a question from Kevin, who asks, typically what height increases are being constructed on flood walls and embankments above the existing arrangements?
Richard, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, the range of heights for the whole scheme, it does range quite. There is quite a range in heights. It just really depends, I suppose, if a specific area. I mean, ultimately the heights do range from 0 to possibly 3 meters plus. All I would say is that 3 meters are not in an urban area or not in a wall next to a house as such. We do have a large embankment, I would say, for cell 1 at the back of Park Road in the landscaped area there. But the majority of them are probably in the one under the 1.5, I would say. If you're having to look at Grangeburn area, for River Carron, for Bowman Drive, Chapelburn for Dock Street, you're probably in around the 1 to 1.5 height, I would say, give or take a few hundred mil.
I think the other thing to add to that, Richard, is that we will be going over that at the more focused sessions, that we've got specific plans that will give the indications of the heights in specific areas. We just thought it was too much to cover all sort of 27 kilometres today. So the focused areas that focused sort of engagement sessions that starting tonight will cover the height of flood defences in those locations in more detail.
Thanks for that, Alan. Richard, Judith, are there any other questions in the chat?
There is not any other questions here on the chat.
Okay, so we've got a thumbs up to the response for the first question, so hopefully that's provided a little bit more information. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to drop them to us just now. As Alan said, there will be a bit more information provided at each of those 5 focus sessions over the next week and a half.
I think just to add to that again, Alistair, that basically all the information that we've went through today and that we will be going through at these more focused sessions will be made available on the website just after we've completed the engagement sessions next week. So any plans or images that people have seen either today or in these other events, they will be made available on the website that people can have a look at them.
There's another question there. It's come in on the event Q&A. What does alignment mean? It might be worth if the person they're able to maybe give a wee bit more detail, or is that enough for you guys there? Sorry.
It's probably okay. I mean, when we talk about an alignment of a flood, the defence, we just purely mean for where it's going to be, a location, more or less. It's nothing more than that.
Yeah, it's just the position that defence needs to sit in to provide the best benefit to the community. And obviously that varies depending on a number of factors. Whether you're in a sort of greenfield area where you've got lots of space and very few constraints that stop, or you have more flexibility in a greenfield space where you can put the defence position, or in some of the more urban built-up areas, you may have other constraints with underground utilities and other things in the existing environment that need to be worked around as far as possible. So the final position is obviously something that we're currently working on, and those details will be shared. More information on those details will be shared at each of these 5 events.
Okay, another question there. How many trees along the Grange burn will be removed and where? John?
Good question. So at the moment, there are plans drawn up for along the Grange burn corridor. That is one of the areas where, as I just mentioned in the previous response, there are obviously a number of constraints. We've got roads on either side of the Grange burn. We've got trees on either side of the Grange burn. We've got utilities under those roads and footpaths. So there are a number of constraints in there that determine the positions that are more or less suitable for putting defences. And as Richard shared on one of the slides earlier, it's not just the works that need to be done above ground level. What you see once the defences are finished, there's considerable works required below ground level as well to typically put in the steel sheet piles and then cap that off with some form of a wall, whether that's a concrete finish or a stone clad finish. But there's effectively considerable works below ground that then ultimately provide a smaller wall above ground. So at this stage, I can't give you an exact number of how many trees along the Grange burn corridor will be removed, but there are options for along that corridor. One of which would be there would be trees that would potentially be taken away to allow construction of the defences, and then replacement trees would be put back in their place. There are other options along that corridor as well, but those other options may mean different impacts on communities. For example, roads that are currently two ways may have to be reduced to one way, or defences have to be put in an alternative position. So those kind of things will be discussed at the focus sessions for the Zetland Park, Abbots Road area, and for the Greensburn Road area. We'll look at some images to show some of the implications of what the different alignments may mean for those communities.
I think, Alistair, just to add to that, there was information published, I think it was last year, on the website, specifically about sort of the results of the tree surveys that were carried out, particularly in the sort of Rannoch Park, Zetland Park, and along sort of Park Road, Greensburn Road areas, and also the sort of likely impacts in terms of where trees would be required to be felled based on the sort of current proposed scheme, and then also where replanting would take place. So there was quite a bit of information published last year that's still available on the website just regarding trees in that particular area.
Hopefully that answers that question for the moment, but if there's any follow-up to that, then happy to take any follow-up to that as well. I'll just give it another minute or two, see if anybody else has any other questions to add. Don't think there's any more questions coming through at the moment, Judith. Oh.
End another meeting. That's just. They just, yeah, it's just a thank you.
Yeah, discuss further. Somebody has to leave for another meeting, so I think if there's no other questions in today's session, we'll maybe just wrap it up at that. As I say, you know, the other focus sessions are still available for people to join those as well if the times suit. And as Alan mentioned, you know, all the information from each of the sessions will be recorded and made available as well. So if you can't attend live, there'll be an opportunity to go back and review that at a later date. And obviously, I would encourage everybody to spread the word around your local community, speak to your neighbours, and try and encourage people to get involved and understand what the proposals mean in each of those different communities. As I said a couple of times during the presentation, you know, this is certainly not the end of the journey. This is only partway through the proposals and the development. There will be further opportunities for people to get involved throughout this year and next year before we go into that formal process.
Yep, and there's a feedback form that will be coming out to you, and as we've mentioned, we're hoping to continue the conversation with you, so it would be great if you could spend just a minute or two just completing it and letting us know how we can continue to engage with you and more people.
Yep, echo that, Judith. Thanks very much for that. So yeah, just like to thank everybody for their attendance this afternoon. I hope you found it informative, and as I say, the website is another good source of information, and obviously the email address. If anybody has any specific questions, you can send them through to us, and I'm sure Judith will be in touch shortly with that feedback form that she's mentioned. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to hear from you all soon. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Kevin.